Today I'm going to talk about landscape photography filters and more specifically when to use which filter. So this isn't the first time I've talked about filters on this YouTube channel. I've talked about ND filters, CPL filters, I've talked about filter brands, and all sorts of things like that. But what I really haven't done is sort of give an overview of when you want to use certain filters. And while a lot of my videos go into detail, it sort of assumes you know when to use them. So that's what today's video is going to be, more of an overview of what I consider the three main filters of landscape photography and when and in what situations you might want to use them and how they impact that situation. So if while you're watching this video in this overview and you sort of see, well, I know I want to use an ND filter now, I will be linking to my other videos on filters down in the description below. So you can sort of dive into where I give more specific examples out in the field of how an ND filter works and how a CPL filter works and cover some of that material. So this is more of an overview. If as you start to get familiar and comfortable and you want more details, just check those links down in the description below. So like I said, I'm going to cover three main filter types out there. There are other filters out there, things like black mist filters and things like that that you can use to get some other effects on your photos. But for landscape photographers, I feel like there's three main categories that come up, and those are ultraviolet or UV filters, circular polarizing filters or CPLs, and neutral density filters, ND filters. And those are the three main categories I'm going to look at today. So let's get into that. So the first filter I'm going to talk about is an ultraviolet filter or a UV filter. And really it is just a clear piece of glass. And many of them, what they'll do is they filter out some UV light, which back in the film days was a little more important because a strong daylight would sort of give a blue cast to the image. So film photographers would use UV filters on the front of their lenses to sort of filter some of that out so you didn't get that blue cast in the film. Now, digital sensors are a little further along than that, and they aren't quite as influenced by the UV aspect. So that UV filtering aspect isn't quite as important as it might have been back in the film days. However, you'll still see landscape photographers using UV filters. One, they like to use them for lens protection. They like to put that extra filter on, so if their lens bangs into something, sort of falls on the ground, that filter will take the brunt of the damage. It'll get the scratch or something like that, as opposed to the front lens element. So that's one reason why modern day landscape photographers might use a UV filter. Another reason is if you're out in a very dirty, dusty environment, say you're out on sand dunes in the wind and you've got lots of blowing sand that's going to come in and you really just want to keep that off the front lens element, that's a case where a UV filter might be useful. You put that on, similar to protecting your camera from a drop or a fall, all the dirt, all the sand, maybe you're on the ocean side with sea spray hitting, all of that hits that filter, which you can then take off, clean a little more thoroughly, or if any of that sand happens to damage that filter, you can just replace the filter and not the front lens element. Now with that said, I actually don't carry a UV filter out into the field with me. I'm just not a big UV filter user. In my opinion, the lens element is actually a pretty solid and thick piece of glass. It's pretty difficult to damage it, in my opinion. Not to say it'll never happen, but I feel like whatever's going to damage that front element was probably going to also punch through that UV filter. Now there's varying opinions on this. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I just choose not to use that. Now in a particular sandy, dusty situation, I could see if I had one available, then I would put it on, but since I don't really carry one out in the field, I'm sort of just taking my risks like that. I don't really use one. But to sum up, with a UV filter, you're looking to sort of filter those UV rays to keep from getting a blue cast, not quite as a big a deal with a digital sensor, protect that front lens element from accidental bumps, falls, things like that. And of course, if you're in those extreme dust, dirt situations, that's when you might want to use a UV filter on your lens. So next up, we've got the polarizing filter. And I've talked about these in the past, specifically circular polarizers or CPLs, which is probably what I'll be referring to it through here since that's the type I use. But what a polarizing filter does is it helps cut down on those reflections and glare coming off of the water, and it can even cut it down from coming off of the leaves and foliage and things like that. So when would you want to use a CPL or a polarizing filter? So anyone who follows my channel knows I like to photograph waterfalls. Just a big waterfall fan. I just find them super calming. But one of the things you'll see at a waterfall is you get the water coming down, and usually you'll have rocks next to the side and things like that getting caught in this water spray. Then you've got the sun coming through, and the sun hits that water spray, that the rocks covered with the moisture, and it just creates this glare. So you can't see any of the detail of the rocks because that glare is coming through. Well, polarizing filter can help cut down on that glare. You put your filter on, you can adjust that polarizing filter by turning it to the level of filtering you want, and it'll sort of cut through that glare. It lets you sort of see through, and it sort of starts to let you see that detail of those rocks. So it's very very popular with people that photograph waterfalls or other moving water. Perhaps you're in a creek in the woods and the water's flowing through, and again, you've got the moisture hitting the rocks, and you even have the surface of the water getting that glare, getting that reflection. If you put a polarizing filter on, you can sort of cut through that and just sort of get that little bit of extra detail, give that water a little bit of extra deepness, give those rocks that might be covered in moisture a little bit more detail than you would without a filter. Somewhere it applies to if you're on the edge of a pond or on the edge of the ocean or anything like that, where you just want a little bit more detail under the surface of the water that's being blocked by the glare. The polarizing filter sort of cuts through that glare to give you that extra level of detail and depth. Now, another place that a polarizing filter can be particularly useful is when you're photographing trees or things with leaves or lots of grasses, or even in the fall when you're trying to get those fall colors. Tree leaves and plants and everything like that, they have a lot of moisture in the green in the leaves, and that creates a glare. Even though it hasn't been raining, there's still a bit of a glare that comes off, and it just sort of cuts in that detail and sort of reduces the saturation. If you put something like a polarizing filter on the end of your lens, you can adjust it and sort of cut through that glare as well, which lets you see some of the detail of the leaves and increases that saturation a little bit. So if you're out photographing fall colors and what you're seeing isn't quite what your camera's getting, you can use a polarizing filter and just sort of boost that saturation of those leaves just a little bit and can make for some very pleasing images. So don't forget that a polarizing filter is a valid option when you're out photographing leaves, or whether it be summer, spring, or fall. All handy times to use a polarizing filter. And finally, it can even affect the blue sky. So if you've got a little bit of blue sky in your scene and it's sitting out there, the polarizing filter will just give that blue a little bit more deepness, a little bit more saturation to it. Part of the advantages of using a polarizing filter on the end of your lens. So those are some of the situations you might want to use a polarizing filter. Things you're photographing: water scenes, waterfalls, creeks, edges of ponds, and the trees, tree leaves, plants, anything like that, where you sort of want to cut through those reflections, cut through that glare to give your images a little bit more detail and a little bit more saturation. Okay, just a couple things to keep in mind when you're using a polarizing filter. One, to adjust it, typically what you do is you put the filter on. If it's a threaded filter, there's going to be a part that threads on and then another element that sort of turns. If it's a magnetic filter like this, usually fits in the magnetic ring, sits in there, and you can rotate it. And rotating adjusts the amount of polarization effect that you're going to get. And you can watch. I recommend watching through the viewfinder when you're photographing some of these scenes. Rotate the polarizing filter and you can watch. You can see it go to sort of maximum effect into almost no effect. And these are sort of season to taste. It's not always the right decision to go to the full polarization effect. Sometimes that looks a little overdone and you want to turn it a little bit more to sort of back off of that. Sometimes you just need a little bit of effect. So sort of watch through that viewfinder, watch the back of your camera as you rotate that polarizing filter, and it will adjust the strength of the effect and sort of season to taste. Now, the other thing to know about polarizing filters, because sometimes you'll see people thinking this polarizing filter works great, then they'll go photograph another scene and they don't understand why they aren't getting the same effects. Polarizing filter's strongest effect is when the sun is hitting the object you're photographing perpendicularly. Just how the light rays bounce off of that, that's when your polarizing filter can be strongest. So what does that mean? That means if you're photographing something at sunset or sunrise, or even just pointing straight into the sun, or when the sun is behind you, your polarizing filter is going to have minimal effect. So that's why it might be different from one time. You might be photographing a waterfall where the sun's coming in from the side, and you're getting this nice polarizing effect. It's very obvious. Another time you move and the sun's coming in from behind you and you're like, why is this not looking the same? And it's just because of the direction of the sun. It is dependent on how the light rays are hitting the object that you're photographing as to how much polarizing effect you get out of the filter. So the polarizing filter is my favorite filter. If I could only own one filter as a landscape photographer, the polarizing filter is the one that I would go with. I find it super useful. Part of that is because I do find myself in the Midwest where there's lots of green and lots of trees, and I do autumn photography, fall photography, so it helps with all of that. And I love to photograph waterfalls and streams, and there's lots of glare and reflection, and the polarizing filter helps cut through that and give me more pleasing images in my opinion. So the CPL, or the circular polarizer in this case, is my favorite one. Now I keep calling it a circular polarizer, and that's because I'm sort of focusing in on that because that's the type of filter I use. I use the ones that go on the ends of the lens, you know, like this, they're circular and they go on. There are kits that are square filters and they put a little frame in front of your lens and they come through here. For the most part, I use the ones that go directly on the end of the lens. I typically use magnetic filters, so they're nice, easy, off and on. I've talked about those before in the past as well. So I will be putting links in the description for how to use a CPL in more detail, as well as some of the magnetic filters that I use. Okay, next up we have neutral density filters, or ND filters. And these can be confusing for a lot of people because there's a couple different variations both of type of ND filter as well as strength of ND filter. So as you can see right here, these are super dark when you look at them. And essentially, how I like to describe it is they act as like sunglasses for your camera. So if it's really bright out and you can't get the shutter speed you want, you can use ND filters of varying levels to change the amount of light getting in to your camera and allow you to change your shutter speed, usually slower. So let's talk about that. Why would you want a slower shutter speed? So say I'm photographing a waterfall, I get my exposure set just right, but my shutter speed is still too fast, and I'm not able to get that milky smooth white of a waterfall when it comes over. So if my exposure is right, what am I to do? Maybe I've already got my aperture up to around f16, and I don't want to go any more than that because then I get worried about the issues of diffraction. So what do? Well, I can use an ND filter, put it on front of the lens, which is now letting less light into the camera, so I can slow my shutter speed down so that that water passes through the frame and gives me more of that effect. Now, it's not just for waterfalls. The same could apply if you're photographing a creek or a river and you want that water to look real smooth through there instead of being stopped in motion. So another case where you can use an ND filter. Clouds. If you're photographing clouds in the sky and you want them to just be a little softer, sort of blur out from the movement, you can use an ND filter so the shutter speed stays open longer because you're letting less light in the camera, which softens those clouds. It gives it more of an ethereal effect. So that's sort of the situation you want to use it. Okay, so one of the complexities of ND filters is they have different strengths. These are usually measured in stops of light. Some people will call them like an ND8 filter, which is equal to a certain stop of light, or an ND64 filter. But essentially what that is, it's a measurement value for how much light is it blocking. So let's stick to stops of light. So for example, the set of filters I have has a 3-stop filter, which means when I put this filter on, this is an ND8 filter, equivalent to a 3-stop filter, is it's going to reduce the amount of light getting into the camera by 3 stops. What's that mean? So when I put it on, that means I can actually slow my shutter speed down 3 stops of light to allow more light in. There's varying levels of filtering. Like I said, I have this 3-stop filter, an ND8. I have an ND64 filter, which is equivalent to a 6-stop filter. So if the water's moving really slow and I really want a blurred effect, I may want to go to this 6-stop filter to reduce that light even more so that I can slow that shutter speed to get the proper exposure. And then finally, a 10-stop filter, or an ND1000 filter. You can see how dark this is, which reduces the amount of light getting in the camera by 10 stops. So I can really slow that shutter speed. Super handy for those brighter days or anything like that where you really need to get a lot of that light out of there. ND filters can be stacked, so if you need more than a 6-stop, or maybe you want to get around a 13 or 15 stop, you could put your ND10 on and then put on either the 3-stop or 6-stop filter and get to either 13 or 16 to play with. So they are stackable, so you can change. But essentially what it comes down to is they're measured in how much light is it reducing getting into the camera. And like I said, I tend to carry a 3-stop, 6-stop, and a 10-stop. And the other complexity to ND filters is they come in multiple types. Not only do they have different strengths, there's different types of ND filters. I tend to use, just like my polarizing filters, circular filters, go on the end of the lens. And like I said, these are magnetic, they just snap onto the end. There's screw-on filters, but I like the circular ones. They just go on. They don't take up a lot of room in the pack, so it keeps the portability of them nice and easy. So that's what I have here. Now, in addition, these are solid ND filters, meaning they apply that reduction in light the equal amount through the whole piece of glass. So it's 10-stop at the top, 10-stop at the bottom, and it applies it the whole way. Solid ND filters. Now they also make these in square filters, similar to a CPL, and then you get a little attachment to the front of your lens and you slide in these square filters. Some people prefer those. I go to the circulars just because I think they're super portable, and with the magnetic system, super easy and efficient to change in the field. I have videos on magnetic filters linked in my description down below. So that's the solid ND filters, specifically circular in my case. Another type of filter is a variable ND filter. And what that has is it has a little lever on the side, so you can change the strength of them. Whereas with my solids, if I want to go from my 3-stop to something more, I have to physically replace the filter, put on a 6-stop filter to use. With a variable ND filter, this is still applying the whole filtering level across the whole thing, but if I turn this lever, I can change the strength of the ND filter. Now for still photography, I don't really use a variable ND filter. Sometimes there's some quality problems with it, which I'm not going to dive into specifically here, but just be aware you can get some of these weird X's across the picture if you don't get a nice quality filter. And for me, still landscape photography moves slow enough that it's pretty easy for me to physically change my filters as I need varying strengths. Now, if you do a lot of video, a variable ND filter can be very valuable because you're moving from place to place, changing light conditions, and it's nice to be able to just change it very quickly on the fly. That's a variable ND filter. And finally, you've got graduated ND filters. And what these are is you have the top part is darker than the bottom part. And so what that's useful for is you're photographing a horizon where the foreground might be a little dark, but the sky is really bright. You can get one of these graduated ND filters, get it in front of the lens, sort of adjust it so that dark line is right at the horizon. And now your sky will be filtered and reduced, but your foreground will still be okay. So it sort of lets you capture things in one shot as opposed to multiple shots or anything like that. So I don't use graduated ND filters. I tend to rely on trying to get the shot in one shot, and then I'll use Lightroom or Photoshop to do some edits where I can specifically decrease the exposure or reduce the highlights in the sky. So I fix a lot of that in post-processing. There are still people that use graduated filters, but again, I tend to hike into my spots, trying to keep my load light, and so I just try to stick to the simple filters, easy to use, and not have too much stuff to carry out in the field. But that's essentially what they do. They're to help you apply a different level of filtering effect at some point in that filter. So again, foreground dark, sky bright, you might use a graduated filter and get great effects, and it would reduce the amount of post-processing you have to do because you've already accounted for the big variance in light. So that's ND filters. Like I said, what you're really trying to do with an ND filter is slow your shutter speed down. Handy for when you're photographing waterfalls, streams, or moving water, where you just sort of want to get that blurred effect, maybe a seashore, we've got the waves coming in around the rocks, and you just sort of want to get that smooth look and give just an interesting creative feel to it. It can also be used on clouds to give them sort of a soft feel to it, sort of blur them a little bit with the motion they have. And that's where you'd use an ND filter. You can combine an ND filter with a CPL filter to get both effects. And like I said, that would be where you're photographing a waterfall and want to reduce that glare, but you also need to slow your shutter down. That's where you'd pair the two together. Now, I have 3 ND filters here. Again, circular ND filters. But if you can only budget for one filter, it can get expensive to go out and gather all of these up at once. For an ND filter, if I could only go with one, I would get a 6-stop. That seems to work in most situations for me and gives me the flexibility. It's nice to have the 3 and the 10, but if I could only have one, it would be the 6-stop. So those are the 3 main filters I feel apply to landscape photography. There are others. Black mist filters might be something that you could use. You know, there's other types of filters, but I think the UV filter, the ND filter, and the CPL filter are really the ones that come into play most often for landscape photographers. So I hope this helps clear up when you might want to use these filters, whether you're new to filters, trying to figure out which one you want to buy first, and knowing, well, which one will I use? When would I use it? Hopefully this helps answer some of those questions. Now, like I said, this is a high-level overview. I try not to go real deep beyond just a cursory explanation of what these various filters do, but for the ND filter and the CPL filter, I do have more in-depth videos, including me using them out in the field. Again, those links will be down below. And if you're starting to gravitate towards one, like I said, CPL to me, I love my CPL, but ND filters are useful too. But you start to get a feel for them, which ones you might want to use most often, be sure to check those links out because I do go into more detail about them. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. That really helps the channel out, helps YouTube show it to other people, and it's greatly appreciated if you hit that like. And if you see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching.